what we've been working on for the last number of years, in particular with SAIT has an R&D group called the Green Building Technology aspect or offering, and they have almost 100 researchers in SAIT's R&D facilities, and very advanced in green building technology. So that's part of the reason why we've been doing solar panels and cogen and air tightness and the type of cooling system that you saw in the greenhouse. Combining those things, and it's some of what I'll cover in this talk, we're actively pursuing all 5 levels of net zero. We're not there in each case. We certainly can be there electrically, but you know we're moving that ball along. So that's a good transition to my presentation. So this is something that I enjoy looking at just because I'm warped that way. But what they did is they did a comparison estimating what did land use look like 10,000 years ago. As you know, 2/3 of the planet is ocean, and only about 1% is fresh water, a surface area. And so essentially the rest was divided between forestry and grassland. And then by the 1700s, you know, urban growth crept in, but even today what you'll see is we're sort of 1% of landmass is used up by cities and so forth. But that's an interesting number to focus on. Of course, our forestry has shrunk very dramatically as we have crops and grazing on the various parts. Really interesting when you look on a landmass basis, only about less than 10% of the globe is actually high quality agricultural land. Tremendous amount is obviously mountains and desert and all of these things that aren't necessarily great agriculture space. So when we're thinking of energy, I often put energy in a context of what is the connections, the nexus between energy and buildings, energy and food. What you'll hear me say a few times in this presentation is, when you think about it, and I came across it a number of years ago from somebody that called energy the master currency, a guy by the name of Chris Martinson. And he said it's the master currency for all species and always has been, right? And when you stop and think about that, it seemed a little foreign to me, but then you stop and think and you say, well, as an example, why do birds migrate north? Well, in the spring, there's an awful lot of energy, bugs, that are available to those birds that they can be there in mass, gorge literally, and they're traveling a long distance, but there's a net energy gain because they go to that space where it's so available. So when we look at history, people did that all along as well. So when we entered into the Silver and Bronze Age, what we were doing is we were using an inordinate amount of metric tons of trees to produce a much smaller amount of charcoal that allowed us to produce a small amount of silver and copper that were key tools that allowed us to first enter into the agricultural age that we did. So wood has long been a really big and important driver for us for energy purposes. And when we think about what those trees are, not all trees will say, well, a pine tree is really mature if it's 100 years old or maybe even 150 years old. But an awful lot of our tree species, and the really valuable ones, hardwoods in particular, for the most BTU, the most heat value, they're often literally 1,000 years of stored sunlight, right? That's truthfully what a really mature walnut tree, teak tree, etc. That's what it takes, right, for them to get to that level. I mean, this is just an example of looking at redwoods, and as we know, we basically have a tree museum left of them, right, in a few spots, California and so forth, because there's so few that are left that are that diameter. When you look at how they ship those trees, granted it was a fairly small train, but you know, one tree is basically consuming that train transportation. That was a great source of energy in a way, but it's in our lifetimes, you know, those Mark Twain redwoods were cut down in 1892, and obviously 1,000 years later, we can hope to have that diameter back, right? If the conditions are right. So one of the things that we'll spend some time chatting about is looking at, as I say, that nexus and connection between energy and other matters. So maybe by show of hands, I'd be curious, how many are hearing about natural gas matters, whether it's Russia, Europe, etc., these right today from a European standpoint? So maybe a third or less. Well, what is happening in Europe is obviously natural gas prices are really dramatically rising. They've quadrupled in the last few years. Very, very inflationary. And that's a really big deal for Europeans, and how are they going to heat their houses and businesses, just like it always has been from a wood perspective. You know, when we think of Romans and we say, well, you know, they always seem to be military and expanding, etc. An enormous amount of the impetus of why the Romans were constantly conquering new territory, all the way up to the UK and that kind of stuff, they were always after more trees, that Bronze Age, being able to build ships, etc. And it's still that way in Germany, as they are looking at, wow, there's a big price increase, maybe a shortage of natural gas. What will we do? And so this at the bottom is just showing Google searches in the last few months where they're saying, well, maybe we've got to use firewood. Maybe we've got to go back to trees. But when we look at that from an energy standpoint, what we end up really, in my opinion, having to conclude is, I call it a Gronko world, right? We went from being all of 1800s and earlier, always less than 1 billion people on the planet. And now we're at 7, 8 billion people on the planet. And a lot of space like this that needs to be heated. Well, if we're just cutting down big trees, we won't have any in short order. We can't do it that way. But there are really, really smart and intelligent ways to do this. And so we look at the Japanese, and for 700 years, they've not cut down their big, mature cedars. They just said, look, there's a different way to do this. And so it looks like a strange way to grow a cedar tree, doesn't it? I came across this, Jordan gave it to me not very many months ago, and I'd never seen that. But essentially, by doing that, that ginormous root system that took probably 700 or 1,000 years to develop, how fast what we call a mature cedar that's now maybe 100 or 200 years old, how fast do they produce branches because they have that massive root system? It's such that in a pretty populated place like Japan that loves building with cedar, they haven't had to cut down trees. Instead, they grow them in a different way. So with lots and lots of these things, there's big challenges, but there's transformational thinking, and there's intelligent responses that allow us to avoid Bronco words, right? So I have fun looking at some of these things from an energy perspective, and looking at building materials as an example, and saying, well, when I look at producing a metric ton of concrete, it needs 5.1 GJs of gas to produce that ton of cement or concrete. For glass, it's 5.3 GJs. For a metric ton of steel, it's 21.3 GJs. 1,000 GJs is going to provide 668 square feet of building, right? It's a lot of energy. One of the things that is really intriguing with the sprung way of building is that this building is 3 pounds per square foot, right, overall. The aluminum is the big user. So 1 metric ton of aluminum needs 64.9 GJs to produce that metric ton. So that 3 pounds per square foot is equal to that 668 square foot of building. So now we're comparing apples to apples with the steel and glass and so forth. But instead of 668 square feet requiring 1,000 GJs, we're able to build that same amount of space for roughly 70 GJs. That's what they talk about with embodied energy in buildings. And when you're talking net zero kinds of things, some of the definitions would just talk about the energy consumption for heating and electricity and so forth. But when you start talking about other things that are sort of beyond LEED, like the Living Building Challenge and so forth, they'll start talking about, well, we have to understand what's the embodied energy, and then what's going to be the operating energy, and how do we maximize all that. So if we're going to use any trees for heating, let's hope that it's the minimal number of trees, if you will, right? Because we just lack for land, as we'll get into in a moment, and we compete for that land, whether it's growing trees or for growing food crops, right? Sometimes when we say energy is the master currency, and what we did with the Green Revolution is we started literally eating fossil fuels, that sounds really strange, and we probably don't think that we have. But in fact, we absolutely have. So when we're essentially mining 1 metric ton of potassium fertilizer, we're using 13.8 GJs. When we're mining phosphorus, we're essentially using 17.5. And when we're producing nitrogen fertilizer, and those are the 3 big plant growing fertilizers that you absolutely have or you really can't grow anything, right? You need an additional 78.2. So in another way of phrasing it, the embodied energy in our food is greater than less than 700 square feet of glass and steel. Pretty amazing in my mind of how energy intensive that green revolution has become, and pretty challenging from an inflation standpoint. So the question becomes, well, what can be our intelligent responses around that? Can we change that? Can we avoid the Gronk Award? So when we look here, as I say, before the late 1800s, we were always less than 1 billion people on the planet. And now in 2030, or projected to be in 2030, I should say, we're expected to be at least 8 billion on the planet, maybe beyond that. And so when we look at arable land per capita, what you can see is it's been going down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, we didn't feed everybody we wanted to feed in 2005, but we weren't so bad. The question becomes, are we going to get worse in that regard, or are we going to actually improve in that regard? And I think we need to absolutely improve. So part of that green revolution, often we'll think of, oh gee, you know, we used to use these kinds of horse-drawn farm equipment, and we went to fossil fuels like the below picture farm equipment. And that's certainly part of that energy intensity. And the nitrogen fertilizer, which predominantly comes from natural gas, that's part of that energy intensity, but it's really not the big part. The big part is really all of the processing and transportation and then consumption sorts of things. So in this graph you'll see where all those numbers come from. And so you see when those birds fly north, and they need that net energy gain. If they were getting a 1-to-1 energy gain from that food, they probably wouldn't fly north, would they? It might only be 1.2, 1.4, but you know, they're raising their young, they're getting a net energy gain, and then they go back south and they get another energy gain. That's how humans first started farming, and that's what we always got, is that if we were using 1 calorie, we were getting 1.2, 1.4, or whatever. But in this new green revolution, as it was called, what we've evolved into is that we're actually using 10.3 calories of energy for every 1.4 calories of our own bodily consumption. And that is a really, really important challenge in front of us to understand. And what are we going to do to change it? Because when we look at fertilizer prices, what that chart shows is that the connection, the nexus of fertilizer prices and food prices are absolutely connected. And so as we're seeing natural gas quadruple, food prices will do that as well. They're well on their way. And all too often, those connections are not understood. So, as we like to believe, we show in a very tiny way in our greenhouse that you just toured, and as we mentioned to you, by having fish, we're reducing our energy consumption. The fish feed is allowing us new revenue potentials, but the fish water is actually providing, particularly in nitrogen, most and can be all of our fertilizers. So it's a different way of doing things. We see a lot of talk these days about protein and whether we're going to get it from bugs and, you know, whatever. I prefer to let the fish eat the bugs if we're going to feed somebody something. And, you know, we end up looking, again, at just efficiencies. So, you know, sheep, as an example, we think, well, they're pretty small and they're probably pretty efficient. I find it fascinating that they're the least efficient at converting food to a pound of protein, right? Cattle get really kind of beat up reputationally in a way. And fish is just this amazing creature that uses very, very little energy, and so has this very, very high food to a pound of protein conversion ratio. And so we can do a great deal with that. We can solve a lot of things, and bugs certainly can be in the mix. So all of that is by way of just giving a juxtaposition, right? Because Holland, or the Netherlands, fascinating to me, is the second largest exporter of food in the world, and yet they're 237 times smaller than U.S. landmass. And how have they done that? Predominantly in greenhouses. Predominantly today, they're using mined and natural gas-derived fertilizers. They're going to need to change some of that, and we're seeing those pressures from a number of points. But, you know, they haven't been using any more nitrogen today, even though the production has been going up, than they were using in the 1960s. So it's not unlike Canadian farmers. They have been really focused on things like precision farming and so forth, and getting better all the time. And that's great. So what other sorts of things can we do? How can we perhaps help Alberta farmers and from a cattle standpoint? So this is a project that Sprung fortunately had the good fortune to be involved with for pretty close to 5 years. So that building is 160 foot wide, or pardon me, 100 foot wide and 160 foot long. And what happens with that building is, so it's less than an acre, right? Well less than an acre. And because they're growing in those vertical towers that you see on the bottom left, what they're growing is food, fodder as it's called, for dairy cattle. And in that building, they're growing enough fodder to feed 17,000 head of dairy cattle, 20% of their daily ration, right? And so that's essentially replacing almost 500 acres of cropland. So do they still need hay fields and other sources using up that grassland? Absolutely, without a doubt. But you can see we can have a different mix, right? And so that's what those folks have done very well at proving. And the center picture is literally what the fodder looks like. And any of you that have been around any grass grazing animals, what you'll always find, whether it's horses, cattle, whatever, is the spring shoots is what they'll fight for, right? They'll lean their head far across the fence to try to get at those spring shoots. It's highly nutritious. It's very healthy for them. And so what these guys are able to do is provide spring shoots every day for those dairy cattle. So what this is showing is another facility that we're now involved with, and very exciting. We can do very small dairy operations and feedlots and so forth. See, in feedlots, the cattle don't eat all that healthy, and so they actually are on antibiotics an awful lot of the time. And that's not a good chain by any means by the time I go into it. But the bottom line here is what they're finding is by feeding them better, and that's always the case. Food be thy medicine, right, is what Hippocrates had long said. Same for us as cattle or whoever else, right? But when we come back to that land question, what you end up seeing is by going vertical and doing this with fish fertilizers and so forth, potentially we can keep the green revolution going. Potentially we don't have to say, well, we've got, 3 billion too many people, what are we going to do, right? Potentially we can say, well, we'll figure out a way to feed all of them. Here's some really intelligent solutions that we can bring to the table. I like looking at this particular chart because when we look at history and before, say, 1850 or 1900 or something like that, essentially it didn't matter how you sliced it and diced it, our energy came from the sun. We might not recognize that, but, the sun made the trees, the sun made what we would eat, as well as all of our work animals, and back in the day, domesticated animals provided really the tremendous amount of the work. Fossil fuels, our ancestors weren't foolish when they recognized the huge energy density available to them in fossil fuels and what it could do for them. And so as you see on that powering the economy chart, as those fuels took off, basically we needed far fewer people on the farm. We could specialize much it, and we had an awful lot of people that could move into so many specialties that, it is true that with fossil fuels, we ended up with the highest quality of life that existed. If we look at royalty going back in the 1800s, we live a quality of life they never did, right? Back in that time, the wealthiest man in the world didn't have a fridge, didn't have running water, had lots of servants, lots of people that worked for him, but Cornelius Vanderbilt was his name, but he didn't have half or more of the things that we call essentials today. Well, how would you live without a fridge? Well, he might not have loved it, but he didn't know any better, right? Because they didn't have it. But what this does is put it spatially into a perspective that says for the average North American, using what we use, spatially over our lifetime, how much coal, petroleum product, and natural gas do we use? And that's the dimensions for each person, right? So I started with that picture of the globe to start with and said, well, this is how finite it is and how much land and all of these kinds of things. And when it comes to energy, part of our challenge in understanding where are we at is it's below ground. It's not all that visible. There's a perpetual debate. We have an infinite amount of energy. We don't have an infinite amount. Where are we in that cycle? And, you know, perhaps the Romans went through that same sort of debate saying, well, just over there, we just take UK and now we'll have enough trees for however long. But they found that challenge, right? Because with fossil fuels, we can end up just simply looking, how is fossil fuels developed? How long does it take? And the fact is when we're using fossil fuels, all we're doing is using ancient sunlight. Nothing different. Derived from algae, right? In a big way. So it's concentrated, dense energy from eons ago. And the fact is one physicist, he might not have the calculations exactly right, but he did the work to say, well, we use almost, we use that volume of fossil fuels that I just highlighted. And he said, when I put it in this perspective of how it evolves and time-wise and so forth, what he ended up calculating is he said, we use this many BTUs equivalent, or GJs per day, whether it's coal or it's natural gas or whatever. And what we use every day right now is the equivalent of 7 years of sunlight. So when we're looking at renewables saying we need solar PV to provide us the same amount of energy as fossil fuels, the question becomes, well, how is it going to provide 7 years of sunlight, right? If we think about it in those kinds of ways, we start making far and away more intelligent decisions. And there's things that we can do. We can figure that stuff out to a degree. But it is fascinating. We have never, since the 1800s, replaced one source of energy with another. We didn't stop using wood. If you look there, biomass is essentially wood, not entirely. We use less now, but in most other cases, we use the same amount of coal, but we added oil. And then we use the same amount of oil and coal, and we added natural gas. We've only been using natural gas, believe it or not, for 50 to 70 years. It's not very long at all, right? Our grandparents can tell us, at least mine can, stories of when they didn't have natural gas. And so you see, there's another calculation that people put out, and they say the thermodynamic population and the work that people do, right? So fossil fuels, rather than cutting wood to heat a house and all the energy that went in that, we don't put any time to that. We don't need to. The gas just comes and heats the house, obviously. When you put it in a perspective of various machines that are making life so much easier and the amount of work that gets done, well, you know, a man pushing a lever, not very much horsepower. An ox pushing a load, somewhat more horsepower. But when you look at it as compared to a steam engine or a marine steam engine from the 1850s, 1,000 times more horsepower, right? And so that's the miracle of that master currency and dense energy. But how might we replace it, right? How might we have intelligent solutions? Well, when we think of greenhouses, we think, well, you grow tomatoes and you grow kale maybe and that kind of stuff. And that's great. That's what the Netherlands are doing in part. But there's folks doing some other really exciting stuff in addition. So these are examples, more on the development side than not, but people growing algae. And why would you grow algae? Because it's the base form of oil and gas. And so I can actually potentially become renewable in that aspect. See, this was a calculation Chevron did a while back, and they said, if I come into landmass and I say, well, I'm going to use corn or soybeans, and I'm going to do ethanol, which is a bad idea. I don't mean to pick on them, but it's a bad idea regardless, right? We end up saying, well, we need all the mountain ranges and the desert and all the cropland, etc. And we can still, with all that in the U.S., we can only provide fuel for 50% of the current vehicles, or even less if we of electric car charging, right? But an interesting thing is algae, very small amount of land mass, and we can have 50% of the petroleum fuels as a replacement. There's issues. It's not all solved. It's not like it's slam dunk, let's do this. But if we understand it, there's a great opportunity there, and we can get there. We look at and we villainize oil and gas today, and again, that's a Gronko word thing. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Our ancestors were smart moving to that stuff. There was a reason they did. They worked with solar in their own way. They didn't have sophisticated solar panels. They worked with wind in a big way, you know, and then they saw, well, gee, look, here's what that coal can do for me, and I don't cut down this many trees, and I don't fuss with this many windmills. When you look at all the things, the plastics and the lubricants and all the things that come out of a barrel of oil, and what will we replace that with, it's interesting that algae can actually make most of these, because it was the base source of it anyway. It's the lipids, it's the oils in the cell, right? If you look online, bloom algae runners exist, kind of cool. Consumer reviews aren't that great. They fall apart pretty fast. That is what we were looking at. But I'll bet they'll get better at it, right? An interesting thing that's emerging quite a bit is that algae can actually be used to power computers and so forth. So there's been scientists that have been trying to figure out, how do I do artificial photosynthesis, because that's really challenging. And Mother Nature in some ways is saying to us, why do you want to reinvent my wheel? Just harness it, right? Use it. So this is a sprung structure that's operating now on the Horse Lake First Nation property, and basically what's happening here is they take wood waste, slag as they call it, all the branches and stuff that they cut off trees. Weyerhaeuser has huge amounts of that in and around that First Nation, and they grow algae in a greenhouse, and with a pyrolysis process and combining the algae, etc., Weyerhaeuser goes from having all these slag piles that they pay penalties for GHG emissions because it's just sitting there decomposing, and then the land over on the other side is in desperate want of all those nutrients, because Mother Nature never knows what waste is. It's always going round and round, isn't it? So what they end up doing here is they create soil amendment in this greenhouse by using algae, and so Weyerhaeuser ends up in a very different place on that side of things. When you start combining greenhouses with buildings, there's so many huge advantages. So this is where we learned about using energy in this way on greenhouses. I was fortunate to be able to take training from the guy that designed this for the Rocky Mountain Institute. And if you're not aware of the Rocky Mountain Institute, it's long been kind of a practical research and development lab in the US, and they've done so much in terms of renewable energies and so forth. But back in the 70s, they did this, and they said, let's build our head office. So what you're looking at is their lunchroom, literally. And let's attach a greenhouse to it. So when the sun's shining, we're going to actually heat our head office. But we'll end up with a really nice space, and we'll grow some food. And so what I want to show you is that's been done for a couple of years now. Socrates lived in such a house. And His house was in the north hill side. It faced south. He didn't have glass, but they used mica and let quite a bit of light in. And the reason they did it was because they were running out of wood in his area. And so these are very, very practical solutions that we've known of for a long time. In fact, this is an example of Sprung Senior, who's generation 3 and mostly responsible for inventing the building that we're in. And he had a big passion for exotic waterfowl, and had a house that basically they built into this kind of structure that had natural daylighting, not unlike this. So they had exotic waterfowl that needed much higher temperatures than Calgary, and he didn't want to spend a lot of money heating that. And so he heated that area in that way as well as the house, right? Very practical. Well, can we do that on a big scale? Well, here's a company by the name of Manitoba Hydro that has the monopoly on electricity and natural gas in Manitoba. And they built this head office, I believe it's 22 stories. And what they proved is, even though they're a natural gas distributor, they don't need to use natural gas in that building. So why not preserve that? Because we're sure going to need it for bronze tools or making concrete, all kinds of things, right? So that was their philosophy. So about half of their heating and cooling comes from geothermal. The other half comes from what they call their solar chimney, which is essentially a greenhouse, the entire south side of their building. And so this is what it looks like from an energy standpoint. So the average buildings in Canada, even new buildings, 279, I want to make sure I say that right, kilowatt per square meter. And the Manitoba Hydro building, Manitoba Hydro Place as they call it, uses only 88 kilowatts per square meter. So in a cold place, they have boilers, they have natural gas, it's backup, they don't turn them on. The building was opened in 2009, they proved they could do that, right? And they did it with a lot of steel and glass, but Sprung can do that differently. And so their outside offices aren't different. They look out and they have natural light and windows and all that. But they have a second layer here, which is the solar chimney or solar tower. At first, when they first designed it and put it up, they said, well, it's just going to be a utility savings corridor. That's all it's going to be. But the fascinating thing that they found is people gravitate to natural light. If you have an office with no windows, and the office that has windows are available, what happens? There's a competition for that office, isn't there, every time? Well, they had the same thing in that they couldn't keep the people out of that utility corridor. They were dragging chairs in and having a meeting, like in this space, and at lunch, impromptu, some people were doing yoga and blah, blah, blah. And then they just said, well, why are we fighting that? Let's actually make it available. So a great space. The only thing they're missing, in my view, is they should be growing food in there. I've covered quite a bit of the air tightness, so I'm not going to spend too much more time, but that's air tightness comparisons that SAIT did. And so when you're looking at, like, as an example, California Energy Code is considered amongst the most stringent, and that's the air leakage they allow to have a score of 2. Well, you can see on the Sprung buildings we're half or better on those scores. So that's one of the reasons why we do as well as we do on building net zero buildings and so forth. This will kind of look weird to people, but it goes along with that Rocky Mountain Institute example. Again, it's how do I use passive solar? How do I use that light in the best way possible? So these people literally said, we're going to build these greenhouses that are going to be a nice place to sit or whatever, but that's essentially their furnaces. That's their boilers. You can see how those It goes by tube. So in the tube, going into the building is fans. So the sun heats up that little space and it gets good and hot, and the fans just put it into the building, not unlike your furnace in your house, right? Kind of a nice looking furnace in my mind, or a boiler. It doesn't always necessarily come up with the best numbers in the world, but you know, would we do that if we're running out of trees, or we can save 1,000-year-old trees, or what have you? There's a lot to be said for it. So our greenhouse is very energy efficient in that way, and we use multiple tools that we've shown you in the tour. And so again, when we're trying to create acreage space, if we go vertical, right? And so this is kind of fun. Maybe you guys have spent some time on Kaylee's downtown Calgary and the patio, as they call it. But that's a sprung structure that was built above that TD bank. And it's used for partying, which is fine. The plants are very green because they're plastic. But it could be lots of things, right? It could be lots of things. Oops, stop that. That's what it looks like on the inside. That's a rooftop view of it. And as you can see, there's a whole lot of downtown buildings that they don't have any of those elements yet of that Manitoba Hydro building. And if you start looking at it and say, well, can we do this with steel and glass? The answer is not really, right? Because the retrofit is going to be very, very expensive and hard to do. But when it's 3 pounds per square foot, I can do it on existing rooftops. I can cantilever it literally over sidewalks, etc. In this case, Harvard wanted some more space for eating, and they have a lot of historical buildings and they lack real estate. And so they designed that one because from the ground you can't see that building. It doesn't impact the historical building at all, but it added, I don't know, 5 or 10% more space. So you're seeing that on grocery stores and rooftops like this. But what they end up having to look for is these really, really intensely built brick buildings and so forth, because the weight loads are so very heavy. So there's not very many places you can build it. Otherwise, you do like this hotel did in Thailand, and they're using very light buildings, quite commonly used greenhouse materials, but they're very extraordinarily sensitive to wind, let alone Thailand. They don't have to worry about snow, probably, or hail, but it's a big deal. We've been kind of reluctant, in my view, to get after that because fossil fuels were so easy, so cheap, and you can't wait too long by any means for these transitions. See, when we look at what happened when we recognized fossil fuels, we had cheap, abundant energy, and it produced cheap fertilizers and those cheap foods and huge population growth, and that's what we have. Lots of economic growth. At the moment, we can get all depressed and bothered and look and say, well, maybe we got energy inflation or scarcity, and we got fertilizer issues and water and soil issues, and therefore, food is becoming unaffordable and a problem, etc. And what will we do? Well, again, hopefully, what I've shown you with these examples is just a number of intelligent responses that we can put in place so that we meet the challenges.